Yesterday's conversations were incredibly rich, so powerful. And one theme continued to come up over and over and over again, the discussion of equity and gentrification and what our movement is doing about it. And we're lucky that this morning we have a distinguished panel to join us to dig in on that topic and really explore what the challenges are and what the solutions might be. So I'll bring them up in just a second, but first I want to set the stage for the topic. Yesterday, Councilman Pickett from Baltimore underscored the relationship between our visions for trail network development and historic practices to segregate people. Some of the lines we are viewing as connectors were historically those used to separate us from each other. And the relationship between the past and the present couldn't be more intricate. While most of us know of our country's sordid history of threading segregation practices into our land use and transportation planning decisions, only recently has there been a growing recognition that segregation, not only in the form of history, but in the form of different delivery mechanisms, persists today, resulting in great costs of lost lives, lost income, and lost potential. Those of us working in planning and related fields are finally waking up to the great calling that we must act intentionally and proactively to right these wrongs. This is no longer a siloed issue in the social justice and environmental justice fields. It is squarely in the planning and public policy fields, and even more squarely in the trails and active transportation movement. The intention of this plenary is to demonstrate that planning for equity is accessible, and it is something that we all can and should be doing, but we have got to do it right. So to help us dive in deep and figure that out, we are joined by 6 leaders in this space from across the country this morning. A conversation that Lynda Lopez, a reporter with Streetsblog Chicago, will moderate. So please welcome Lynda and Beth from LISC Milwaukee, Grace from TrailNet in St. Louis, Juan Carlos of the Latin United Community Housing Association in Chicago, Tatiana of the 16th Street Community Health Centers here in Milwaukee, Vaughn from the 11th Street Bridge Park in DC, and Sterling Stone of Gearing Up Bicycles in DC. Thank you guys. Welcome.
Yes, so just to start off with, I wanted to introduce myself and tell you a little bit more about myself. I write for Streetsblog Chicago. I mostly focus on transit-oriented development, community development, housing, and I tend to write around anti-displacement land. So whatever I write about, I always tend to think about like the intersections of gentrification, displacement, how are things impacting housing. So I don't really know if you can talk about transportation and streets and not talk about that intersection. So that's kind of how I approach my writing. And I first got involved with this space after college. I got involved with the campaign around the 606 Trail. So for those of you not familiar with it, it's a 2.7-mile elevated trail in Chicago that runs from Humboldt Park all the way to Wicker Park. So it spans different neighborhoods in the north side of Chicago. And it opened in 2015, and there was a lot of concerns about gentrification along the trail, which came to be true. So I got involved with the local campaign to door knock and inform residents about the trail, and also put together property tax relief workshops to help residents potentially stave off some of the effects of the trail. And I also was involved with like community meetings to develop a platform for affordability for the neighborhood. So we gathered residents' input, like what does a platform for affordability look like in the neighborhood, especially in the face of like the 606 Trail, something that could potentially bring benefits to the neighborhood, but also brings these unexpected or expected effects to the neighborhood, like gentrification. So that was sort of my first major campaign around that issue, and my background kind of informed my idea of equity. Just growing up in Humboldt Park in Chicago, my family, we were always renters. So I think that idea of housing stability was always at the forefront of my mind, especially when you don't own a home. I think you're a little more susceptible to things like landlord tendencies or different things like rent increases. So that was sort of always salient for me. So in college, I worked with the local organization, tenants' rights organization in Chicago, working on a hotline to inform tenants of their rights. And just being in the context of, so I went to the University of Chicago, just being in the context of Hyde Park and its effect in the surrounding neighborhoods also kind of informed the way that I view the world in Chicago and the effect that institutions can have in neighborhoods. So I think a lot of the work that I've done has informed my view of how I approach this work. So I always try to approach it in a way that, or with the question in mind, how do we reach the most marginalized people? When we have something in mind, I think we should always have the question of like, who are we reaching, and are we reaching the people that need it the most? And if we're not, I think we have to evaluate the way we're doing this work. So that's sort of how I tend to think about equity within this work. So I'm excited for this panel. I think everyone brings really interesting perspectives. So I'm gonna kick it off. So the first question is gonna be for Tatiana. So you work here in Milwaukee as the Healthy Choices Manager at the 16th Street Health Centers, and you do a lot of outreach within the Latino community. So how do you engage the Latino community in a way that's inclusive and in a way that brings more equity to neighborhoods in Milwaukee?
Thank you. Yes, good morning, everyone. I think community engagement has been a big issue, very popular term used in the last, I don't know, a couple of decades. However, through community engagement, I'm not sure if it's happening in the projects, in most of the projects, especially when we think about communities of color, like the Latino community, the African American community, the Native American community. And those communities are traditionally disengaged from the projects that are happening in their neighborhood and the projects that are happening on their behalf. And that can be a big issue. Many of the strategies that sometimes we use as community engagement are to setting up a meeting that might be just an informational meeting out there, and then being surprised because we have very low attendance, and or we have an online survey, very complicated survey, that is not translated, not just to the language of the community, but in the terms that the community will understand. And then we end up not having enough feedback. So some of us think if that's enough in terms of community engagement. And some others think that that's just enough. Check, we did it. And unfortunately, when we really think that's not enough to engage communities. And when that happens, the possibilities for those projects to fail, or at least to not be as successful as they could, can be very high. And I think it's very important when we think, are we looking at the communities in the same way that we look at the other partners in the room? My perception is that we don't see the residents and the communities they represent as partners, and let alone equal partners. And because of that, we don't have the same effort in the relationship building, the same intentionality, the same strategy that we will use when we're going to connect, or we're trying to connect with government, with businesses, with organizations. So I think that's a big issue, because at the end, the project, it's just ours, it's not theirs. We don't have their input, their say, and it's a big issue. But I think with all this comes the opportunity to make it different, especially when we think about trails. Trails are at the core of communities, or they can be at the core of communities. But human disconnection, depression, obesity are key issues in our communities, especially in urban areas and communities of color. And so trails have a huge potential. They are just right there in the environment. They can be the safest space. They can be the space for health. They can be the space for family connection, community connection that people really need. But for that to happen, I think residents really need to see what trails can bring to their lives. But at the same time, the community team needs to understand that their vision is not complete until it has the voice of the community, and until that vision has been reshaped by the people. I think that's the only way we can really make it make it happen in an equitable and successful way.
Mm-hmm. Like ensuring that you have the community in mind the community's interest in mind as you're doing the planning.
I think the community needs to be all the way from the visioning and the planning through the evaluation. And the community is usually missing. We just do a couple activities here and there, and that's it. And because of that, again, the projects are really our vision, and we think that we are the only experts, and we kind of underestimate the wisdom and the knowledge that the communities have. And that happens constantly. And an engineer or an urban planner knows a lot on that area, but he doesn't live in the neighborhood, so he doesn't have the responses that neighbors will have. So when you put them together, the possibilities to really invest the money effectively are big, but that's really not happening, I think, in many of the projects.
Thank you so much. So we're going to be moving on to Vaughn. So Vaughn, you're the Equitable Development Manager for the 11th Street Bridge project in DC. So curious, tell us more about that project, your role within it, and how do you approach building partnerships to ensure a more equitable approach to planning? I think as Tatiana was saying, always with the idea of the communities in mind. How do you approach that in DC?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I, at the 11th Street Bridge Park, what we're doing is transforming an old vehicular bridge into a recreational park. And it's going to span over the Anacostia River, which is one of the two rivers that runs through Washington, D.C. But from the very beginning of this project, we had over 200 meetings really just going into the community, asking the community if this is something the community even wanted. And so after there being some excitement around this idea of a bridge park, the next question that we had for the community was, okay, if this is something that you want, we want you to help us to shape it. We want you to help us to program it. And so we had a design oversight committee that was made up of community members. They pretty much created all of the requirements for those design teams that were submitting for the design competition, all of the programming ideas. So we're going to have a performance and art space. There will be an environmental education center. There will be a canoe and kayaking launching space. There will be urban ag. There's going to be a play space for children. But all of those ideas came directly from the community. But as we were talking with the community, one of the things that had come up, and as we looked at even other parts of the city where development had come into the city and across the country, we wanted to make sure that as this development came into the community, that we could try to mitigate some of the negative consequences that comes when you bring development, like gentrification and displacement. So what we did was bring together stakeholders to help us to solve that very question. What can we do to make sure that we can continue to invest in the residents that are living in that community so that they can continue to survive and thrive in that community? What came of those, about 4 town hall meetings, was our Equitable Development Plan. Our Equitable Development Plan was made up of 19 different deliverables that focused on housing, on workforce, and on small business. It's my role to manage a lot of the partnerships that are helping us to implement a number of those strategies in the Equitable Development Plan, and to work closely with the community to make sure that we are putting the community first. I think oftentimes when we think about development, we're looking at projects, and I would, if you don't get anything else from me today, as you're going out to do these projects, ask yourself, who am I doing this for, right? And so it should be for those residents in the community. And if it's not, then you need to pivot and reevaluate some of the things that you're doing. And so we ask ourselves every day, who are we doing this for? And if we are doing something that's not in line with what are the needs of the community, then it's something that we need to change. And so as I share that, even with our Equitable Development Plan, we have continued to have this open feedback loop with the community so that now there aren't just 3 major areas. We have a 4th, which is our cultural and art strategy. So we went out to the community and had more meetings to find out what are things that we need to do in order to make sure that we can maintain the cultural and the arts and the who we are, of the voice of the community. And so those will be coming out in our EDP 2.0. And so I think it's just continuing to work with the community. You know, when we first started to work on this bridge park, we had no idea that we were going to be working on housing, and we were going to work on small business, and we're going to be doing this work in workforce development. But I think really having an ear with the community, and Tatiana mentioned like this idea of community engagement. I think you have community outreach, and then you have community engagement. Community outreach is oftentimes what Tatiana described, where, you know, here we're gonna do something, we're gonna go out to the community, we're gonna tell them what we're gonna do, and then we're gonna check off. But community engagement is being very intentional, having the community involved from the very beginning, and not just hearing what they say they're gonna do, but listening and having the community a part of the process so that you're implementing the things that they would like to do, and you're working together to come to solutions to help the community.
And I'm wondering, how do you define community as in like who sits at the table? How do we like get to have as much representation of this idea of community?
So one of the things we did early on was really, I think you got to look at it two ways. One is, as an internal organization, making sure that you're doing what you say you're doing, right? And so internally, like the makeup of, there's only a staff of 4 of us, but all of us live within the area right around the bridge park. So we have 2 people that are what they call, so the Anacostia splits DC, one side is west of the river, one side is east of the river. 2 of the people make up east of the river, 2 west of the river. So there's good diversity internally, right? But as we go out to the community, it's talking to the churches, it's talking to the community associations, it's talking to other nonprofit organizations, it's finding out who else we need to be talking to make sure that they're at the table as well. And so it's a lot of just building relationships. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of building relationships, because oftentimes you can't quantify that on a grant report, right? To say, okay, I went out and I talked to 150 people and I built this relationship with them. But it's oftentimes the most important work that we're doing. And so building those relationships also takes time. And so I think that's why it's so important to start to do that work up front. But yeah, I think a lot of that just is coming from building relationships. And as you have those relationships, asking those people to introduce you to other people and to almost like to invite you into their community as opposed to barging in.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're gonna move on to Grace. So Grace, you're helping to lead a project through connecting St. Louis in which you're trying to develop a plan for low stress mobility paths through biking and other means for residents in St. Louis. How have you approached that through the advocacy lens, and how do you think that's related to our vision of like equity within neighborhoods?
So for anyone who's not familiar with it, TrailNet is a bicycle pedestrian advocacy organization. So we're a nonprofit in St. Louis, Missouri, and work in the region as well. So there's been a lot of really great projects happening in St. Louis itself. We have the Shoto Greenway, which has been talked a little bit at this conference so far, but we also have a light rail project coming in. Our metro is reimagining the bus system. We're also looking at big development projects that are also impacting the region, but what TrailNet noticed was there wasn't an intentional discussion of how are we connecting our most vulnerable, distressed, whatever word you want to use, disadvantaged communities into these areas where there is already affluent people who live there who can already see infrastructure like this get built. So how are we ensuring that no matter who you are, what age, ability, race, what you look like, that you have full access to high quality facilities that offer the best low stress connections. So TrailNet's been working on a vision for a network of protected bikeways and sidewalk improvements, but also looking at neighborhood connections and understanding how this impacts different residential areas. And so we've been working within St. Louis envisioning this out, and I'll be the first to admit it's a little bit of a top-down planning process because we really wanted to ensure we are being intentional in the discussions that we were having and knowing that we saw a major gap in need in St. Louis, that North-South communities, that's where most of our low-income, predominantly Black or people of color communities live, that needed connections to where they weren't being planned for. So what we did was we actually took it a different step forward. We didn't want to do just a bike ped plan, finding the best destinations people wanted to connect to. So we're also working on land use policies, because as an advocacy organization, we have a role to focus on different advocacy opportunities, such as affordable housing, looking at how we can prevent our impact on displacement and not spur gentrification to occur on different trails. So we're working alongside housing advocates, looking at what inclusionary zoning, what community benefits agreements, and how that looks like in St. Louis. But we're also looking at how we design these places, who will want to be using these spaces, and how do we actually create inclusive design. And again, what role does a bike ped advocacy organization have, just because we're also limited in what we can do. But TrailNet is also working on ensuring we're getting diverse representation. So how are we doing engagement? What does that community look like, and what is the purpose of that engagement? So we're changing our strategies depending on how familiar they are with TrailNet, or have they never heard of us. So what sort of engagement strategies work best? Is it a community that is technology driven, so maybe they'll appreciate a smartphone or an online survey, or is it actually going to those community meetings, hearing what they need, ensuring that we're representing their best values and helping uplift that neighborhood in itself. And TrailNet is also further looking at funding and maintenance strategies, because we can't just fund these projects without a good maintenance strategy behind that as well. So we're tackling a lot from all different sides, but we really want to have an equitable vision of what connecting St. Louis means, because it's not going to be just TrailNet doing it by themselves. We actually have had over 1,000 hours worth of just community and city partners who've been involved in our planning process donated. And then we've also reached out to about 4,000 different people about this project as a whole. So the next step for us is now releasing where we're going to be focusing some of our advocacy efforts directly, of where we're going to be connecting St. Louis and working alongside all these other great projects that are happening in the region, ensuring that we're creating equitable connections no matter where you live in St. Louis overall.
And how do you ensure that, like people that have never interacted, let's say with developing a community plan for something, how do we ensure that they're included as well, like especially with some of the jargon that is part of urban planning? I'm wondering, how do you reach those people that it might be a new kind of idea to like think about inclusive design, or like inclusive neighborhoods?
Yeah, so it is a good question, because I mean, we all will define equity differently. We were just talking about that as a panel, how we individually define equity in the work that we're doing. So I do think the planning world and trail development world, we use a lot of jargon that doesn't actually connect with the general audience, because at the end of the day, let's be real, they probably don't care. And they really want to see how it's going to impact them if they're going to have to see this development happen. So how do we envision it with them? So we're always trying to break down our language, and we challenge each other as a team when we think a word might be jargony, for example. But we're also working within the community itself by not only building partnerships with other nonprofits or community organizations that are working there, but we also hire people who work within the communities themselves. So we call them our community champions, and we pay them for their time to be a part of our process and helping us do that engagement work. Because what you see is a lot of people usually being tokenized as the voice of that neighborhood and not actually doing true engagement, because you thought you reached out to the two vocal people who are not white, for example. So that's some of the work that TrailNet's been actively doing. And another thing to touch on in working on equity yourself, I think it's really important, not also as an individual working on it, but as an organizational level, to talk about what equity means. I think that step gets missed a lot. So that's some of the work that I've been trying to do internally at our organization. So whether that's going to a racial equity training, hiring someone to come in and do trainings with us, we're always intentionally talking about equity. And I think that's an important role for everyone in this room to play, to challenge each other and what you mean when you talk about equity, and again, who are you serving and what is that community?
Yeah, and I think it's important to I guess keep redefining it based on like who you interact with and their needs, and the more inclusive the movement becomes, I think the more voices you have, and I think that you kind of have to keep redefining like what you mean by equity based on those new voices that might come in. But I wanted to go now to Sterling. So your organization, Gearing Up Bicycles, so equips DC youth with experiential education, job training, and I love biking, so I'm really excited to hear more about it. I bike to work every day, so I'm really interested to hear more about how like youth engagement, how is that an integral role to like mobility justice, and I say mobility justice in a way that creating streets and neighborhoods where people have as many options for mobility. So I'm curious, how does youth engagement fit into that?
So, good morning, everyone. How's everyone feeling this morning? We are a small nonprofit in Washington, D.C. We were born out of need. If you've ever been to D.C., it costs like $15 for a beer, which is not it's like a bottle of water is like $21. Like it's ridiculous. But we were born out of need. There is people like to ride bikes. Like, let's be honest. Everyone's ridden a bike and feels the freedom that comes with that. But when you walk into a bike shop and the cheapest bike you have is $700, and you're trying to do a job that only makes a couple bucks maybe if you're lucky because you spend it all on getting to and from work, you're not included in all this stuff that we're doing. Washington, D.C. has 64 bike shops in this city, or in the city and in the surrounding communities. Of those bike shops, there are zero in 2 whole wards, including over where he's at. 1/2 part of the city, no access whatsoever. Until recently, there weren't any real trails over there until recently. What we did was we decided that, one, we gotta create a way to access bikes, right? So we created a nonprofit bike shop. Instead of just staffing it has anyone ever been to a bike shop? Ever in their whole life? Anyone here? Anyone? There's an old saying, there's a joke that we have in DC that if you want your bike worked on in a bike shop, you gotta go find the oldest white guy with a beard, right? He's the guy you go to. I have a problem with that. This is quote unquote mocha latte now, but it's Chocolate City, right? How come I have to go find a white guy in Chocolate City in only half the city to get my bike worked on? That doesn't make sense. So what we did was we opened up a nonprofit community bike shop that is staffed by kids. The difference is that our kids are learning a trade. Now, all of our kids actually start out as volunteers, and then they have to earn their way to a job. They earn their way to a job with us. That's not the end game, though. Our end game is those 64 bike shops I mentioned, they need mechanics because everybody's in DC is biking. So our end game with them is to not only show them a different career path, but we actually get them jobs with those for-profit bike shops. What happens there is a lot of real conversations and a lot of ground level stuff that is not sexy to always talk about, but we have honest conversations in our bike shop. Kids come in, they were riding their bikes, they got stopped by the police because they were riding their bikes. They were black kids on a decent looking bike, I guess. I don't know why they got stopped. They don't call that, whenever they come in, they don't say, oh, those police were being inherently biased to me. They don't say, oh, that road wasn't equitably developed for me. They say, that cop is racist. I think that we as planners sometimes get caught up in all the buzzwords, and I think that sometimes the buzzwords make us feel better, right? I'm not racist, I'm just inherently biased, it's not my fault. Oh, that trail wasn't equitably developed, so that's why it cut off an entire neighborhood. No, that was racist practices from redlining. And I think that sometimes we have to cut through some of the language, call it what it is, it was racist. It is wrong. And then we can actually have the tough conversation of what do we have to do about it. I was so excited yesterday listening to what's going on in Baltimore. The difference is they didn't just build a park. They programmed it from day one. That's what equitable development really is. You can't just build a building, and I use this analogy all the time. You can't just build a building say, here's a brand new building and walk away. Like, well, what is the building? Is it a Starbucks? Is it a Whole Foods? How do I use this? As a person of color, sometimes when you build a bike trail or even a bike shop, I have no idea how to use it. Even though you've put a sign out front that says bike shop, or you put a nice sign on the thing that says, this is the Mount Vernon Trail, I have no idea how to actually use this amenity. So we decided to take the amenities that were built and program them. So we do free bike repairs in areas that don't have access to bike shops. So in Anacostia, actually this Saturday, tomorrow, I don't know what day it is. whatever Saturday is, well, I'll be in Anacostia 2 days. I'll be in Anacostia. We have our biggest series of pop-up shops. Last year, in our pop-up shops, our free repair shops, we did service 1,700 bicycles at 40 different events throughout Washington, D.C. Most of those centered in Anacostia. The difference is that's funded by our Department of Transportation. We have some great allies in working directly with some of the organizations. And Vaughn, you're talking about partnerships. I can't stress that enough. In order to get my kids to come in the door, I have to go to the schools and talk to them. I have to go to the rec center and talk to them. I wish I could get in more rec centers. But WABA, who is our advocacy group, we are darn near at everything together, right? You can't do one without the other. We're working with libraries and schools and churches and other nonprofits. And the thing is, then I come to a conference like this, and I'm the only one in the room. And it's troublesome to me sometimes, and we were talking about it this morning. It's troublesome to me sometimes that, here we are, we're doing all these programs in our space, but then we're not including them in the planning process. And my goal is to not just, I'm making bike mechanics on a daily basis, but eventually I need those kids here in the room with me. Because we're not doing this forever. If you plan to do this forever, God bless your soul, you're a strong person. But we've got to make another generation, and that generation has to look like the communities that we're building in. If these next generation of leaders are the same, if the next generation of leaders look exactly like us, or don't take this the wrong way, they look like most of you, then you've done a disservice. You've done a disservice to the trail. We're in danger of repeating the mistakes that we're mad at for those highways, because our trails have now become the new divider for our neighborhoods. So whenever you build a trail, plan for equity by programming the space. Make sure that it is accessible in a way that people know how to use it. Not only do they say, oh, I want this there, but I don't know, like a lot of times if you said, oh, I'm gonna build a trail and I'm gonna put this exercise stuff on it, I have no idea how to use some of the exercise stuff I see on the trails. And even those little signs do not do justice. Like I look at them and I'm like, so I stand on this and break my leg this way. Like we have to do a better job at pushing ourselves beyond what has been acceptable and use the language, stop using the language that makes us feel good.
That's true. Thank you, Sterling. I think you brought up some really good points, especially around the need for partnerships. And I think Beth from LISC Milwaukee can speak a little bit more on that. You've been working with, you work on community corridor revitalization and creative placemaking strategies. And I think sometimes within this work, it's really easy to get siloed in within our respective groups and what we're working towards. And I'm interested to hear how do you break down those silos within the work that you do to lead to more equitable planning.
Great. So good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be representing LISC Milwaukee, the local office of LISC. I wanted to just give a quick overview of what LISC is. We have offices in over 30 markets throughout the country, and we're headquartered in New York. But we're really a convener and somebody who builds capacity, builds leadership, and tries to spark innovation in some of the projects, real estate projects and other projects that are happening in a particular market like Milwaukee. So my role is commercial corridors and creative placemaking, which are two things that don't really seem to go together. And when I was asked to speak at a trail conference, I was like, okay, how does this all connect? And I really appreciate Vaughn's comments earlier about you can't just build infrastructure and you can't just build a trail. It leads to housing, it leads to job creation, it leads to commercial corridor revitalization. And when I was doing grassroots work, I feel like trails were always a part of that. How do we create access? How do we get people to jobs? I worked with Melissa Cook on the Hank Aaron State Trail in the neighborhood on the south side, the Silver City neighborhood here in Milwaukee. And it was all about how do we make connections between using the trail to get people from my neighborhood to jobs in the Menominee Valley that they can walk to and bike to. And then how do we help create and program the space and the trail so that people know how to use it. And LISC does that by being that convener, by connecting the dots across disciplines. I was recently at a conference in Nashville, the Complete Streets Conference that Smart Growth put together, and it was all artists and transportation folks. And when people, at the beginning of the conference, they asked people to raise their hand, and it was the most interdisciplinary conference I've ever been to. You had planners, you had DPW folks, you had transportation folks, trail folks, artists, designers, and that's really what I'm excited about in this work is how do we start to bridge those conversations and those languages and that vernacular that everybody uses where sometimes we're all saying the same thing, but we don't recognize that the other person is saying the same thing as we are because we're so caught up in those buzzwords and that language that we use. And so LISC is really tasked with being that intermediary that can help connect the dots. I'm really excited to be doing creative placemaking work. This is not something that Milwaukee tends to have infrastructure around, so it's new. I've been on the job all of 4 months. And trying to build a strategy around how are we engaging artists in this work. So I'll share a resource. Last fall, LISC put together a creative placemaking report called More Than Storefronts. And it's really looking at, and you can find it at lisc.org on our resource page. And it's really looking at lessons learned for how you engage artists into this work and what are the possibilities when you bring artists into planning that are unexpected in a lot of ways. So I'm going to speak really briefly on just a couple of the projects mentioned in this report, and then I want to spend a minute or two on what's happening in Milwaukee around equitable development. So LISC strategy really looks at using the arts as a way to engage people who wouldn't otherwise be engaged. Often when I go to community meetings, I never see teenagers, I never see youth. But if you're on a trail and you're doing an art project and you're asking people to reflect and share their vision for their neighborhood through an art project, you're getting the voices of that young person that can help shape what that trail might look like or what that neighborhood might look like. That you wouldn't otherwise get by asking them to come to a meeting at 5 o'clock, at the community center in the neighborhood because they have other things going on. They don't know that that's for them necessarily. So how can you bring that experience to the young person or to somebody who doesn't feel like those meetings are for them and help to capture what their vision or what their input is for whatever you're trying to create. I think that there's a big opportunity to just be more innovative and to think outside the box and be joyful about the work. That's something, previous to joining LISC, I ran an arts organization called Artists Working in Education. And our whole focus was bringing the arts and experiences like that to young people in neighborhoods. So we didn't ask them to come to us. We rolled in a mobile art studio and did projects in parks, in libraries, in places that young people already are. And I think in a lot of initiatives, we don't do that enough. We say, come downtown to the Greater Milwaukee Foundation and we're having a panel discussion or we want to get your input. People just don't have the resources and time necessarily to do that. So I think thinking about how artists can bring that experience or that opportunity directly to where people are at is really important. And then building leadership. So there's one of the projects mentioned in this report is out of Minneapolis, and it's looking at the block club model, but having artists be the block leaders and doing different projects. For example, they would do poetry picnics in the local park, and you could read poetry and create poetry about your vision for your neighborhood. They also, in Springboard for the Arts in Minneapolis, also has a project that looks at training artists to be community organizers so that they have both that language of the community organizer and that language of the arts, and they're utilizing that to develop more leadership so that those people can, start to influence policy and start to make changes within their neighborhood because they've built their capacity. And that's really what LISC is about, is how can we build capacity, how can we build leadership? And I'm really excited about the way that artists can do that. And then we also have a lot of work around real estate development, both commercial and residential and housing. So the report looks at a project called, in the Fountain Square neighborhood in Indianapolis. And I think there's an important lesson learned in that project. So over about 25 years, there were 3 projects that focused on, real estate projects that focused on redeveloping buildings that kind of spurred an arts and culture district within the Fountain Square neighborhood in Indianapolis. And the projects ranged from a theater to a gallery and artist studios to live-work units for low-income artists. And it really shaped that cluster, that economic cluster within that neighborhood to spur development and change. But one of the things that really came from that was really gentrification and not recognizing the working class families that lived in that neighborhood. There's an Appalachian culture in that neighborhood, so bluegrass, that language, the folk arts that were really ingrained in that neighborhood, that were already there, were overlooked by artists coming in and not necessarily having that connection to the neighborhood. So I think, just thinking about lessons learned and saying even though we have good intentions, that we need to make sure that we're still aware of where there are missteps and to call that out in our own work is really important as well. Locally here in Milwaukee, LISC is really focused around the Greater Milwaukee Agenda and an initiative called MKE United, looking at the neighborhoods around downtown Milwaukee. There's been a lot of development in the last few years in downtown, and there's a fancy new arena, public funded, which I have that's a different conversation for a different day. But there's a lot of worry about displacement. There's a lot of worry about gentrification in the neighborhoods surrounding downtown because of all of the development happening in downtown. So LISC is working on a $50 million fund to really build anti-displacement strategies around the downtown area and to help ensure that as the neighborhoods grow, people in those neighborhoods are growing with the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think gentrification, displacement always seems to be at the intersection of these conversations, which I think is a good transition to Juan Carlos, which we were able to work together on the 606 trail, so we understand some of the nuances there around the issue around gentrification and the concerns around that. So I'm just interested to hear more about working with Lucha, and how do you approach potentially addressing some of those issues and potentially some of the challenges within that work.
Yeah, and thank you for having me here. I love traveling up to Milwaukee, by the way. It's a short drive, but it's not often, I'm not a morning person, it's not often you wake up at 4 in the morning to make it to an 8:30 panel, right? But the topic is important enough that I wanted to come and really learn from everyone here, too. As I'm sitting here and actually listening to all this, one of the themes that I'll touch upon is deeply embedded partnerships, right? And working with groups that aren't necessarily intuitively doing the same kind of work you are and that complement the skills of your organization or of the people at the table. So as it's specific to Chicago, starting with a couple of challenges, and generally, not just with the trail itself, but 2 challenges that we face, not just as Lucha, a housing organization, but as a city, is a deeply embedded culture of top-down decision-making, right? And that's just been, and some of your jurisdictions probably have this as well, right? The other is by policy level segregated neighborhoods that we have. So lawyers like us will call it de jure segregation, that by policy, our neighborhoods look the way they do because of redlining from way back when, and now it's more of a de facto kind of issue. But neighborhoods, we don't come together very often. That's changing now, I think. But these are 2 issues that before the trail even came up, we were still dealing with, right? So now as it pertains to the trail, it's, as Lynda mentioned, it's a 2.7-mile trail on an old freight line. Community members and the communities that we operate in, Logan Square, Humboldt Park, and Westtown, are traditionally Latino, Puerto Rican, and now Mexican American, also with white and African American neighbors as well. But for years, people have seen this abandoned freight line and said, can we have a trail here, right? So this is something that actually started with the community. And then we got a new mayor in 2011, and he said, all right, it's going to happen. But again, issue number one, that top-down decision-making culture just went right into effect. They kind of just rammed this thing in there without ever talking to the groups that were on the ground. And so as a housing organization, and again, partnerships, we were working with DePaul University's Institute on Housing Studies to look at the housing trends in the neighborhood. So we have a great train system, and we saw along the blue line, which is near this trail, that housing prices were escalating. I think they've escalated 130% since 2000, and 48% since the trail came up in 2015. Now, okay, again, we love the trail, right? But what do we do about the housing, the increases in housing prices that are pushing out both renters and owners for two different reasons? And so let me start with that. The interventions that we started on as, again, a housing organization where let's look at the renters. And renters are not able to afford, in fact, our own staff, we've had people move from the neighborhood who are paying $700, $800 for a two-bedroom apartment and are now moving out to the suburbs paying, because they had to pay $1,200, $1,300, you know, from one month over to the other. And if they have kids, there's anxiety there because where are my kids going to go to school? They're going to Lowell School or one of the local schools, and now we're having to move and completely change our social fabric, right? So one is increasing the supply of affordable housing. Now, affordable housing on its own has become a loaded term. So, and we largely work with the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is a very complex way of doing housing development, which we can talk about over drinks later. But all that said, so we want to do beautiful housing that fits within the fabric of the neighborhood, right? So that no one knows that this neighbor is any different from that one. And you know, one of the things that I've been really interested in over the last decade is climate change issues. So we have this trail, a beautiful amenity that's almost an environmental justice issue. Now you had this freight line that had factory zoning all around it, and now it's becoming very residential. It has become very residential. So what do we do about climate impacts as we're doing new housing? We're doing the first multifamily passive house building in the state of Illinois. I would have said the Midwest, but here in Wisconsin, you guys beat us to it. And in short, passive house designation, it's a building that's so well sealed, you don't really need the heat or air mechanicals. We put them in there in the event that it gets maybe a little too hot, maybe too warm, too cold. But if you're operating the building well, it's always 68 degrees in there. If the windows are closed in the winter and you had the heat on for a little while, it stays that way, right? In Germany, and this is talking about partnerships and learning from other places, in Germany there are jurisdictions that require this kind of development. In Chicago, we didn't even have one, right? So we're spearheading that so that along the 606 trail and new trails that come up, as we're doing new housing developments, we're also looking at the environmental justice and the climate impacts. The second piece then, as it relates to the renters, is we were funded by Enterprise Community Partners based in Baltimore, but with a Chicago presence, to do a health impact assessment on the new development, on the new trail. And what we found, we knew we would find there are prevalences of asthma and diabetes in the neighborhood. I mean, it's observable, right? You see it, you know it. We see that with the people that come in the door. What we didn't know, but we found, was there are high levels of anxiety, depression, and isolation in the neighborhood. And it's for two reasons that we found. Number one, it's exactly what I just mentioned, the displacement fears. Lots of folks, particularly Spanish-speaking Latinos, can't afford to live there anymore, have to upend their entire social fabrics, and they're worried about where they're gonna live next, how they're gonna get to work, how they're gonna pay for that. And so on. The other, though, is, as you probably know, we have instances of crime and violence still in our communities, and that's something that we're trying to solve citywide. I think the trail is one of those areas we program with. Now, as it relates to the trail again, we see this great amenity, and we see people that we're trying to connect to it. But the top-down approach doesn't always address that. So what we found is, as we're doing programming on the trail, we're having a lot of success, and Lynda was part of this, working with Logan Square Neighborhood Association, getting the youth on the trail, right? And in fact, one of the often heard phrases is, on your left, you know, people are just racing by on their bikes. But then that lends itself to seniors not wanting to be on the trail, right? They'd rather be on the street, on the quiet streets, waving to their neighbors. They don't use the trail as much. But this goes into the programming at the start, right? What are we building? How are we building it? What amenities are we putting on there? And then lastly, for the homeowners, by the way, who here owns a home? I do, yeah? So this goes into the framing of how we talk about affordable housing near amenities like this. We, if you have a mortgage, get way more welfare than any of the renters that we ever work with ever get because of the mortgage interest deduction, right? The owners get $139 billion in subsidies, renters get $35 billion in subsidies. So there's a big disparity there. But I'm not saying let's get rid of, you know, the subsidy we get as homeowners, but when you have a trail like this that increases housing prices, then the property taxes increase as well. So there's pressures on them. So what we've done is what I call an in-the-box solution with Logan Square Neighborhood Association. We put together an ordinance that went to City Council that said if you're going to demolish homes, because Logan Square has the highest number of demolitions of perfectly fine, what we call 2 flats, 3 flats, 4 flats, which are these multi-unit buildings, which are being demolished to be billion-dollar homes, right? So it's a problem for the property tax issue. It's a problem for people who want to stay in their community but can't afford that, clearly. So we put in an ordinance that said, all right, there's already a fee to demolish a home, right? Let's lift that fee from $500 to $250,000 per unit. And then a trust fund will be set up for if any developer wants to come in and do this. You know, we're not saying you can't, but if you're going to pay that money, $250 per unit, we're going to put that into the trust fund, and that will go to either replace affordable housing or to do roof repairs, porch repairs to homes for seniors who need that but don't have the resources to do it. Now, this gets back to the original challenge, and I'll end with this. It's partnerships are important, right? So you want to partner with nonprofits on the ground that are complementary to what you're doing. You want to, of course, start with community, and Lucha's embedded in that way. Foundations and philanthropy are part of this. But government can be a challenge sometimes, right? And I know some of you probably work for government, and you're having to work within that structure. I used to work at City Hall as well. But when we put forward our ordinance, then you get the trickery, right? So there's another ordinance that came out that said, okay, what we'll do instead is we'll just increase the number of affordable units that have to be built in 10 plus units developments that are built. Now, that's great. We weren't going to fight that, but that's already something that exists, right? They were just memorializing something that the local council people, our aldermen, were already doing. So how can you fight that, right? But that should just be an add-on to our ordinance, we think. And that's just one example of 3. They keep doing this, right? You give an ordinance, and then they put something else forward. My point here is to say government has to be a part of that too, right? Is part of that conversation. And so when you have the holistic partnership going, then you start to see some impact. So to answer your question, we've had some great outcomes in projects, but we're still really working and fighting to get those larger impacts.
Thank you so much, Juan Carlos. I think we have time for one wrap. I did want to pose one question as our last few minutes. I think you all brought up a lot of different challenges and approaches to your work. So I'm curious to hear what's the most important lesson you've learned in working with your communities and doing this work and approaching equity. So we have a few minutes, but if you have any final thoughts to address that question. Anyone can.
I guess I'll go first. I'm the loud one. The most important lesson that I've learned is don't be afraid of the tough, difficult, painful conversations that you're going to have. I've had them with kids. And it's more painful whenever I can have it with an adult and be fine, but whenever you have a 16-year-old explaining to you the power of racism in their community and how they don't feel that this trail is theirs, that hurts. And I did some serious reflection in my first couple months as executive director, but don't be afraid of those painful conversations. Have them, cry if you have to, be angry if you have to, get your feelings, and then do something about it.
I would just say be present, even when you don't have to. Oftentimes, we make sure that we're at some of the community meetings, civic association meetings, even if we're not on the agenda. We try to support a lot of those community organizations, even if we're not a part of it, just so that we can become a part of the community instead of just going into the community when we want something from them.
I think for me the biggest lesson is the power of inclusion. If we see statistics, communities of color are not going to be the minority anymore in the next 30 years. We're going to be 57% of the US population. And those communities right now are the ones that are struggling the most. If we are not effective reaching out those communities, if we don't learn how to truly listen to them, if we don't learn how to communicate in their own language, in their own voice, and if we don't make them feel respected as part of the conversation. And I think the future is not going to be very good. So I think the power of inclusion at this point is extremely important.
I would add that, as much as we want these amenities and these trails, and we do, don't assume that they're inclusive amenities until you've done the groundwork to make it an inclusive amenity. And the second piece to that is data is always important, right? And data, whether it's housing or the numbers of people who are participating, but data is always just the mere evidence of something. It doesn't actually move. So that's where the ground game becomes really important. And it's hard to do, but outreach and engagement, as was said, are key to these.
I guess don't make excuses for the work being really difficult. recently someone asked me, how did you get about 4,000 people to respond to your work in less than a year? And I said, it's because I tried. I tried to do other engagement strategies. I didn't stop just because it was becoming difficult to have these conversations or changing your schedule. So it's good to be vulnerable and to know that that's okay in order for us to work forward, and to know that you're going to get called out in this work, and to accept that and to move forward with it and learn from that too. So I think it's difficult because once you get hurt, it's tough to get back in. But if you don't come back in and work alongside the community, then why are you planners? Why are you working in trail development? Because don't you want to plan for communities that are inclusive, beautiful? Why did you get into that work in the first place too?
I would say as much as you're investing in infrastructure, invest in people. I think to Sterling's point earlier, programming is really important. Paying people for their time and the work that they're contributing to the plan is really important. And figuring out other ways that you're engaging people in the work and paying them and modeling equity is really important.
Yeah, and I like I said in the beginning, I think the question I always have in mind is how are we including the most marginalized members of the community? And I think that's an important question to lead with our work. I'd like to thank all the panelists for this great conversation. I think it was really interesting conversation.